Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 18 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Carolina Hurricanes, in which the Sharks have won 2-1 in overtime, giving the Carolina Hurricanes just their third loss of this season, as they came into this matchup with a 14-2-0 record. So a very impressive win for the San Jose Sharks. And this wasn't some sort of very extremely lucky one that the Sharks only managed to win because they get a couple bounces going their way or their goaltender stood on their head. No, the Sharks actually looked quite competitive with the Carolina Hurricanes, kind of similar to the previous game they played against the Washington Capitals. But you know, the major difference between those two games is that against the Capital, the Sharks gave up a very deflating and unfortunate first goal of that game, while here tonight, while they did give up the first goal, it was one that was a difficult save to make, and so your morale is still kept relatively high compared to that goal from Connor Sherry the other night against Washington. You see, the thing here is for the San Jose Sharks, unlike in previous years where the Sharks could just come out, completely dominate a team, just control the pace of the game, and then easily win a game 5-2, 5-1, the Sharks this year are less skilled than a lot of the other teams on paper. You know, we see some of these matchups against the Hurricanes or against the Blues, the Jets, the Flames, the Capitals, who are just better teams in general, more skilled teams in general than the San Jose Sharks, and the Sharks have managed to actually get some victories against those teams. And the big thing is that the Sharks are not trying to completely prevent the opposing team from getting the puck into their own defensive end and controlling the pace there. What the Sharks have been doing in a lot of their victories is they've been keeping things to the perimeter, and that's exactly what they managed to do once again here tonight against the Carolina Hurricanes. Did the Hurricanes have more offensive zone time? I mean, I don't exactly know the stat, but it would not surprise me at all just based off of the eye test. But there wasn't a lot of penetration into the middle. The Sharks actually did a very good job at keeping things along the boards in deep and also clearing the front of the net, so that the Hurricanes, a lot of their opportunities were very, very one and done and didn't really generate too many high danger chances. The issue that the Sharks have been getting into this season and why they ended up having a decent amount of losses thus far is that when they get sloppy with the puck, when they start turning pucks over and then suddenly it's an extended shift in the defensive zone and you're unable to really exert your full energy to being able to keep the puck to the perimeter, and that's when the other team is able to actually get pucks into the middle and into dangerous areas like in the slot to push the puck through. So when the Sharks are on their game, when they're having a good night in terms of puck management, they're actually able to do a pretty decent job at even shutting down relatively strong teams. It's kind of like the strategy that the New York Islanders like to implement. Yes, the fancy stats don't usually look too fondly on the New York Islanders, and a lot of people say, oh, it's just their marvelous goaltending. Otherwise, once that goaltending falls off, they're just going to get shelled. Well, the Islanders have been an Eastern Conference finalist now 2 years in a row. So clearly they're doing something right. And it's a lot of the games where they're getting shot against, but when they're kept further out, you actually end up in a situation where it's not the worst thing in the world, and it's something that you have to adapt to if maybe your team, your roster is not necessarily as skilled as a different one. But to move away from that tangent, we come into the first period here tonight, and this was a pretty even game, while the Hurricanes, while the Hurricanes, I would say, had the majority of the zone time. The Sharks actually had a couple of decent chances for themselves. You could say even that the best chance of that first period came from the San Jose Sharks. That was Timo Meyer, but in the end, it would be a scoreless first period. Moving on into the second, however, the Hurricanes would get the first goal of the game. Just about a minute in, Tony DeAngelo would shoot a puck where 3 different San Jose Sharks players would try and go down on a knee to block it, and it would all just whiz right by them into the back of the net. Reimers ends up getting screened by all 3 of his own players, so a pretty tough situation there to make it 1-0 Carolina Hurricanes, and the second period would end like that. Still relatively even, though I think maybe slightly Hurricanes favored, but it's a 1-0 game after 40, which is not a terrible position for the Sharks to be in, especially when you look back at some of the previous games that the Sharks have played, like against the Capitals or the one even before that against the St. Louis Blues, where the situation was significantly worse. In the third period, the Sharks actually started to get a bit more energy into their game. I would say that they were the somewhat, at the very least, better team in this final frame, and they would also score the only goal of this final frame coming from Kevin Labanc to make it a 1-1 game, and that would be the score at the end of the 60-minute regulation. So we would head to overtime with a Sharks power play in effect. It was actually rather interesting game in terms of officiating. The Hurricanes themselves only ended up getting 2 power plays, and one of them was a too many men on the ice. The Sharks would only end up getting the single power play called in the last 30 seconds of the third period, though there certainly was not a lack of potential offenses earlier on in this game. It's just as though the refs decided to maybe look past that for whatever reason. There were some trips, there were some hooks, and there were definitely some interferences, and we saw players on the Sharks, particularly Erik Karlsson, get pretty upset about a lot of those things, but in the end the Sharks would get a call late in the third period, and while this goal by Barrabanov in the overtime would not technically be a power play goal, it was about 2 or 3 seconds after it had expired, so the player coming out of the box was not even playing a part in the play just yet, and as such I consider it basically an honorary power play goal, and the Sharks win it 2-1. Moving on to the lineups, we have to, at the top here, talk about Timo Meyer, because remember when I mentioned that this was a very similar game to the previous one against the Washington Capitals, and I mentioned that the major difference was that they didn't give up that first goal. The other major difference was that Timo Meyer, who was not terrible against the Washington Capitals, though not great, was just completely on fire here tonight. He was far and away the best player for the San Jose Sharks. You know, I wasn't paying a ton of attention to what the Hurricanes players were doing. Jarvis looked pretty good. Aho looked pretty good. But I would say that Meyer was also just the best player in this game as a whole. It felt as though, especially later on in this game, second and third periods, whenever Meyer would step on the ice, a great chance would magically materialize. I mean, not magically. He would be able to do that for himself. And it was just so amazing to watch Meyer consistently come on the ice and consistently generate a great scoring opportunity. The Sharks only managed 2 goals in this game, only a single goal in regulation, and that came from their third line here tonight. But it felt as though Meyer was, at least his line, because of how he played, was definitely deserving of at least a couple of goals here tonight. He was just so fantastic, and it just continues a trend for Timo Meyer of being this great throughout this entire season. Fantastic bounce back year for Timo Meyer compared to the past 2 seasons. When it comes to his other 2 line mates, I think they complemented Meyer decently well, and they definitely sort of rode his coattails in this game for Couture and Balcers, who looked decent, though not nearly as great as Timo Meyer did. But as a whole, because of Meyer, the first line was far and away the Sharks' best of the night. On the second line, it was a bit more shaky. Basically, the Noah Gregor Cinderella's carriage kind of turned back into a pumpkin here tonight. I was very happy with his performance in the previous game against the Washington Capitals. I pointed out that he was probably the Sharks' best player in that particular night, and while I knew it wasn't something that was going to continue for the rest of the season, I hoped that it would be able to last at least for a few more games, at least until Dahlin was back from his at least we know now, short-term injury. But here tonight, Gregor just took multiple steps back from where he was in the previous game. He looked not nearly as effective tonight against the Hurricanes like he did against the Washington Capitals. So eventually, we saw some line shuffling. We saw Hertl take some shifts up with that first line. We saw Labanc get some shifts up with the second line. And Gregor kind of fell by the wayside a bit in this one. When it comes to Tomas Hertl, he's just been such a strange player for me thus far this season. And, in particular here tonight as well. There are just some shifts where Hertl comes out and does essentially nothing. Doesn't necessarily look all that great. And then there are other shifts, like in particular the last couple of shifts of this game, where he just comes out and looks like a complete dominant force. Looks very similar to the player we saw back in the 18-19 season when Hertl had something like 76 points that year, and he was like a a Evgeny Malkin light was the comparison that I had used at the time, because when he's using his body to protect the puck, we saw him just completely outmuscle and outbattle Sebastian Aho behind the net twice on the same shift to try and get a wraparound goal, and he came very close to scoring one of them in the last couple of minutes of this third period. It's just that consistency is not there as much. So, for instance, when it came to Timo Meyer, it feels as though almost every single game we're seeing a very consistent and high-level effort from Meyer, but when it comes from Hertl, it's like you flip a coin every time he steps off the bench of whether or not you're going to get that dominant Tomas Hertl in the offensive zone, or you're going to get that Tomas Hertl who kind of mails it in for that particular shift. And then there's Barrabanov, of course. Prior to the goal he had, I don't think he was bad. He looked okay. He also took a hit to the head, which probably doesn't help the situation, though I'm sure he's going to be happy in the end because he did score this overtime game winner. This is now the second time in 4 games where Barrabanov gets hit directly to the head. First one by Dumba against the Minnesota Wild, here tonight by Nino Niederreiter. And we'll see if any supplemental discipline comes from that. If anything is to be said from the Kevin Labanc situation, then we might not see anything. When it comes to the bottom 6, they did manage to generate the goal of this game, the only goal for the Sharks in regulation, as the third line was technically considered to be tonight Weatherby, Labanc, and Matt Nieto. I would say besides the goal, it wasn't hugely impactful, this line. It was basically the first line leading the charge for the San Jose Sharks, just outstanding performance. The second line had its moments, absolutely. And then the bottom 2 lines besides that goal, not necessarily getting a ton generated. Bonino had a couple okay looks on net. I thought Cogliano had a few decent plays. It should also be noted, the 12th forward here tonight in place of Jonathan Dallin, who was of course injured for this game, was Scott Reedy, leading scorer for the San Jose Barracuda. Comes up to play his first ever NHL game and didn't necessarily have the most impressive performance or the most effective performance. Definitely kind of got that reality check here that even though you're dominating at the AHL level and you're doing so well and you're the leading scorer, the NHL is just a completely different beast and you're not going to have as much success when you make that transition. So it's good that Reedy is able to get that reality check now because it allows him to sort of adjust his expectations, and it should help him in the future. I suspect that if Dallin does return for the upcoming game on Wednesday, that Reedy will absolutely be the player who steps out of the lineup for him, and Gregor will likely end up remaining in the lineup unless we see a player like Lane Peterson, for instance, return from injury. On to the defensive side of things, a couple of players who I do want to talk about. The first being Vlasic. I was very impressed with the Shemek-Vlasic pairing the other night against the Washington Capitals. I thought they looked pretty good. Here tonight, I was still rather impressed with Radim Shemek, though Vlasic definitely looked a bit shaky at times. A couple of just disastrous giveaways in the defensive zone. The only penalty that wasn't too many men on the ice that the Sharks actually took was this one from Vlasic, and while I don't think this was necessarily a tripping play, the only reason that this situation materializes into a potential tripping play is because of an awful Vlasic defensive zone turnover just a few seconds earlier. So this is something that, it wasn't a great game for him. I suspect that because this game ended up being a victory, he does stay in the lineup with Shemek for the upcoming game, but hopefully we can get some more consistency from him. Another player who I do want to talk about actually is on the second pairing here, not the usual Erik Karlsson talk, but actually Jacob Middleton. Middleton had a couple of issues in this game, mostly with some overskating. There was this one play where he kind of overskates a puck, which allows the Hurricanes to keep the puck alive in the offensive zone. There was another time where he tries to clear the puck out and it breaks his stick, and we had to see a very, very aware James Reimer be able to save him in that situation, bail him out there. But otherwise, I mentioned this earlier on in the season when Middleton kind of surprised me through the first couple of games of the year. It should definitely be commended. He should definitely be commended for how well he's actually come in and replaced Nikolai Knyzhov. Back at the start of the season, if you told me that Middleton would have played the first 18 games of the year for the Sharks, I would have told you that the Sharks were probably 0-18 with how poorly Middleton had played in every previous performance with the San Jose Sharks. But the fact that he has stepped up so significantly and in such an important situation for the San Jose Sharks with Knyzhov out long-term to start this season is extremely impressive, and he, as I said, should be commended for that. And finally, when it comes to the goaltending, James Reimer, he didn't have to be superb here tonight. He had a couple of very nice saves. There was this 1-2-on-1 between Seth Jarvis and Sebastian Aho that he had to come across the crease to be able to make the save on Aho, so that was a good one. But otherwise, I thought the Sharks did a pretty decent job in front, and Reimer was just very, very solid. But there were no bad goals here tonight like we had seen the previous night by Adin Hill against the Washington Capitals. I said that was a big game changer in that one, and here Reimer, very solid. And at this point, the Sharks have been kind of going back and forth between Reimer and Hill, but I guess it's still early in the season, so you don't have to do this, but I want to start seeing Reimer significantly more than Adin Hill. I don't want to give up completely on Hill, but Reimer has been so much better than Hill. You can't really deny that. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday. They would take on the Ottawa Senators for the second and final time this season. The Sharks, the last time they played the Senators was when they were on that roll to start the season, their third game of the year. They took the Senators out by a score of 2-1, but that was a game in which the Sharks, you could say, were outplayed by Ottawa. So we'll see if the Sharks can have a bit of a better performance, but still duplicate the result in that one. Class dismissed.